All right. So welcome everybody, and to Sia and the ESG Built Environment Council and our sponsors. Thanks for having me today. So I'm John Harris, and I am the um, Director of Technical Integration for Mobile Pro Systems. And I've been in the security industry for a long time. And what I'm excited to talk about this today is, really governance and compliance is a challenge and a responsibility of everybody. And when I started my career, I worked at a big aerospace and defense company, and I was responsible for physical security and compliance and a lot of other things over time. Um, and as I moved into different companies and different roles and smaller sizes, and now I'm with a smaller manufacturing technology company in the security industry. There's about 40 of us at the company, and we still have a lot of governance, compliance, and requirements associated with our business, just like I did when I was with a company of 100,000 employees. And we still have to manage it. And so I wanted to take this time to kind of share my experience and knowledge and some of the best practices that I've learned and acquired over time, and really kind of break the myth that you can't have a governance program at a small company, or that it's not relevant or necessary for a small company. So the goal today is for you to walk away with a toolkit and some methods and frameworks to be able to apply regardless of the size of your company to drive governance, control, and compliance within what's applicable to your business. All right, so the challenge we're solving for is how you, as a small or medium-sized company, manages governance at your organization. So the two questions I want to tackle here is, does it even matter? And why should you care? And so the first one, as I've alluded to, is yes, it does matter, because regardless of the size of your company, the type of company, it is likely that you have some sort of governance and compliance requirement in your business. Often this is seen as like a big company problem. You might say, well, hey, we don't export things, we don't use certain types of technology, or we don't ship over borders, right? So why does these kind of things matter to us? I think and one thing that I'd call out is that ignorance is not an excuse. And so if you think you don't have any compliance requirements and you work in the security industry, you're probably not correct. And so that's one thing, is that we think it does matter, certainly matters, and you should care, because for a small company, running afoul of one of the of a governance requirement or a compliance requirement could be very detrimental to your operation. While at a large company, it's a lot easier maybe to deal with putting legal responsibility in place to be able to combat an issue. Or when I worked at an aerospace company, we had a very, very multi-million-dollar deferred prosecution agreement with the government. The company I work at now, we couldn't afford something like that. So if we had a similar issue happen, it could be significantly detrimental to our business. So it's not just a big company problem, it's an opportunity for all companies, and compliance doesn't have to be something that is a burden to the business, and it's something that we all can effectively manage. So with that, we want to be able to find and apply a right size approach and take a risk-based analysis approach to what's the right programs for us, what's the right compliance requirements. As I'm deploying a governance program, pardon me, what am I even looking to govern? What am I looking to manage? And we'll talk a little bit about what that might look like for us. So why it matters. Going forward, we continue to see ESG pressure on supply chain. So higher level customers, or larger companies that procure from smaller companies, requiring and flowing down certain requirements. And while we may have seen some lightening on those requirements here for US-based companies, Europe and other nations around the world continue to raise or sustain those standards. So if you are doing business outside of the US or have customers outside of the US, you can expect to continue to see those things be applied. Our well-known compliance requirements that we have within the industry that we have to adhere to, NDAA, which doesn't seem to be going away or being relieved anytime soon, and then other export controls. we'll talk a little bit about it later, but when we're building compliance requirements, a lot of it is to look at how our company might expand and grow in the future. And so it's a lot easier to be prepared. You might say, today, I'm not exporting product, but if you get a large opportunity in Canada, that is also an export. To put it across that border, you need to know certain things and have an understanding of the requirements as it pertains to your product. Now, this is kind of a little bit of wild, wild west territory for now, but it'll continue to grow, is these responsible AI use, privacy matters like GDPR, or so that's in the EU, but those applicable state requirements in states like Illinois, Texas, New York, and California that have state privacy requirements that are on the books, and how you comply with those if you're operating in those states. And then cybersecurity has a broad requirement. How are you adhering to that? What are the requirements of how you're protecting data? Responsibility for reporting if you have a breach, and what does that even mean for your business? And so understanding how those apply to you and what those outputs could be. And then lastly, the business impact of it all, having trust with your customer and with your clients, or with your vendors rather. I just had a situation where a new customer that I'm working with reached out and says, do you guys have a business continuity plan? And we don't. So we have to write one. And that's something as a small business you might not think about, but if they're buying our products and our products have a software application to it, and that software application, if the server goes down that it runs on, how do we continue to operate? And so, those are things that we may not think about, but are on maybe a standard vendor checklist for a customer, and we at least need to have answers to that. We were able to say, well, we have a process. It's not a formal policy. Here's the process we adhere to, and then the corrective action for us is to then go write that policy and make sure we have it in place. So, and the takeaway here is that this isn't necessarily an optional thing. Now, it might not be the same or look the same or feel the same for everybody, but there is some compliance, there is some governance in all businesses. And instead of avoiding it, I think we can look how we can turn it into an effective competitive differentiator for your business. So what is governance? So I want to take some time to go a little bit deeper on the definition, what it is, and kind of putting some framework around it before we look to move forward and kind of solve for it. So clear definition: governance is systems for oversight, decision-making, and accountability. And so let's break down that definition a little bit, right? So you have the systems that you're putting in place to manage the oversight of the compliance you're adhering to or the requirements that you're adhering to. The decision-making process, so what do you do when the things happen that require the governance? So you have your rules that are set up. Likely there are things that are going to happen, challenges, issues, things that pop up. What's that decision-making flow look like, and what's the accountability? And so what do you do? What are you notifying, recording? If it's malicious intent, are you doing anything about that? So what is the outcome from that decision-making process? This isn't just the legal and compliance side too, because what's critical for real governance to take hold, real sustainable governance, is the cultural communication and execution part. So it's not just a document that you create that goes on a shelf and you say, we've created governance, we've created compliance. It's the execution of it. So it's communicating it to your employees, it's training, it's something that is ongoing, reoccurring. You have new employees that come on, you have changes in your business that you have to adjust and manage and determine what that means for the way you operate and the way your governance program works. And so this isn't a stagnant activity that's a one-time, and the execution and carry out is critical, because we lose trust with our employees if we just create this and put it on a shelf. I had a mentor really early in my career when I was first getting into export compliance as a compliance professional, and he would always say this phrase: "We can't let this become credenza-ware." For those of us who are too young to remember what a credenza is, it's like a bookshelf and something that sits in the corner of the office. And that was his reminder of, like, don't just put this in a binder and put it on a shelf. We have to live the compliance each and every day. And I think I alluded to this before, but I really want to, hone in on it, is that there's a general misconception that governance is too costly. It's not something we can afford to do. We can't hire a compliance professional. We can't, stand up a compliance organization within our company. And and we're going to talk about why that's not necessary, why governance doesn't equal bureaucracy, why more isn't necessarily better, and having this, huge, comparing ourselves to large companies that have a complex supply chain, and a global operation that require maybe a whole stack of employees to manage their governance and compliance program isn't the right fit for businesses of our size, and how we can take a more focused and appropriate approach when it comes to managing our governance. So we've alluded to this a little bit, but let's go a little bit deeper on how this can apply to you. Like, what are the specific governance requirements? Now, I am not providing you legal advice. I'm not providing you a exhaustive list of things that require governance within your business, but I'm highlighting a couple that are common that I think would apply to most security technology businesses that are within the SIA community, and some for you to check in and look at, to consider as you're doing maybe a self-assessment of what governance requirements may be necessary for your business. So I mentioned NDAA. Those are that is applicable to a certain camera types specifically that have been banned for government usage, and some other technologies. We as an industry are fairly familiar with this. What people may not be familiar with is just the extent of the flow down, and what you can and cannot do. And the regulations on this can be somewhat vague, meaning that, does this apply to me? Does it not? If I use a non-compliant camera, what does that do for the rest of my business? And so if you're not familiar with this, I would reach out to experts or talk to industry folks, probably within working groups, and SIA would have great knowledge of these to understand exactly how this might apply to your business. I alluded to it's a typo there. It's GDPR and privacy regulations. So these are associated with the privacy requirements as we protect people's data. That's employees, that's customers, that's vendors. Any personal identifiable information, or PII, falls under this category. So names, addresses, photos. So if you are making badges that might have information on it, if you're managing any data from customer data that you're holding in a database, that could be relevant. So understanding how these apply to you and how you manage them. If you're working with biometric data, if you're a company that resells those types of services, or you're managing them, or you're integrating them, that might trigger these types of privacy regulations, and something you should be making sure you understand how they apply to you. I think we'll see more and more AI, machine learning deployment policies about how these, the use of it, how it applies to you, if there's any standards that come out, or regulations that impact. And again, I think in the US, the trend that we're seeing is less federal oversight, more state level oversight. And so as states like California tend to be the leaders in putting out new regulation associated with this, I think that's where you want to draw your attention to for our US based constituency, about how this might start to rise up at a state level, and how that could impact your business. Now, I'd say probably the most critical to understand and see how it might affect your business is the cybersecurity requirements and best practices. So, any business, I think, can be a possible target for cybersecurity threats, where phishing attempts, or malware, or other things that people are targeting to get at that customer data, to get at your systems, to try to find something of value that you have. You might have some intellectual property that could be valuable, that they could be going after. And what's most meaningful, I think, to understand is that what does your threat landscape look like, and then what is the outcome that could happen to you if you are the victim of a cybersecurity attack, and what kind of notification requirements are in place, meaning you have to notify your customers if their data has been exposed. Do you have to notify your vendors? Do you have to notify your employees? And all of those requirements. So I mean, that's one that I think is really critical. If there's one takeaway, right, I could say it's probably universally applicable to all. It's understanding that kind of what data do you hold from that privacy perspective, and then what would you need to do if they got exposed? Do you hold any sensitive information that would require you to notify people? And specifically, if you're doing, lastly here, if you're doing government work, whether that's federal, local, state level, if there's any SLED market you're into at all, understanding the contractual flow down and what those requirements might be to you. And so it's one of the first questions I asked when I came to Mobile Pro. We do a lot with different governments, and we had some federal work, and I wanted to look at the contractual flow down to understand, are there any requirements that we signed up for because we were excited to get this order, but didn't really see what maybe controls they were going to have in place. To give you some specific examples, back when I worked in the aerospace industry, the large aerospace companies like Boeing and Airbus and Northrop Grumman would flow down requirements around having certain facility controls in place. And they would go all the way down to the subcontractor, and these had to do with, like, you'd have 100% exterior fencing, you'd have guards in your building, and all these stuff that for the larger companies was really easy to comply to. They already had it, but for these smaller subcomponent manufacturers, they weren't even aware of them because they didn't look at those. And so if they ever audited them on the requirements that they had through the contractual flow down, it was likely they would fail those audits, and they didn't even know they existed. So those are some of the things to keep an eye out for as part of your PO and purchasing process. Are you signing up for anything that either is that you're uncomfortable with, or that's going to cost more, which is okay, but then should you be charging more for that project, for that service, if there's contractual flow down that you have to manage? So really, how it applies to you, what to do to understand this is looking at the obligations based on the services, products, and markets that you serve and your buyer type. So if you're strictly commercial, you sell physical products, you're selling only in North America, there's not reoccurring service software, kind of that's a low risk, kind of low threat environment, then the minimal impact potentially for you. If you're a software company selling all over the world, you're holding a lot of customer data, it's cloud database, things of that nature, you're going to want to understand, or federal work, state work, that's a higher compliance likelihood in that type of operating environment. So doing that type of self-assessment to understand the applicability to your business is the critical step. And then I think part of that too is assigning ownership. And we'll talk to that a little bit as we move into the framework, but I just want to touch on it here, is that if everyone owns it, nobody owns it. So while you want it to be a cultural aspect of your business that's embedded within everything you do, you are going to want to have some assignment of internal ownership of who is responsible for managing this governance process. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a dedicated governance professional. So let's talk about the SMB governance framework. So we'll dive into each one of these in a little bit more detail here, but these are just like 5 different areas, 5 different process steps for anyone to walk through to try to get some understanding about governance as it applies to their business, and then how to manage it effectively without having to overinflate the process, add too much burden, or add too much cost. So you have compliance clarity, accountability structure, lean artifacts, scalable oversight, and governance in action. So compliance clarity, we've alluded to this before, but really this first step is find the regulations that apply to you, track your obligations to those regulations. And as I mentioned before, ignorance is not a defense. So saying I didn't know this applied to me isn't going to fly if you have some sort of, you run afoul of any specific requirement. Things that you could do for tracking your obligations, you don't need to go out and buy some heavy tool. A compliance tracker, I mean, an Excel spreadsheet is a great place to start. Within your CRM, there might be a tool for this, or a project management tool like Monday.com or Smartsheet that you already use. There might even be templates that are already available to help you manage what you're trying to manage. And so I think, we have a tendency to want to over-engineer and have this perfect process, but don't allow perfect to be the enemy of progress, and just get started getting something in place. And so, I think this is the critical first step is just understand what applies to you, understand what those obligations are, and just get started. From the accountability structure, what we really mean by this is that you got to assign the roles and the decisions and the rights to the right people in your organization. And again, I think this will change based on the business. Ideally, you want someone on your leadership team to at least be kind of an executive sponsor of compliance, and depending on the makeup of your company, that might be a different person. It could be, COO, it could be operations director. You might have a supply chain person, whoever. And I'd also look for who has some relevant background or experience in that area, who be willing to say, hey, I have some knowledge here, and I'm able to help, even if that's not their dedicated role within your organization. And then applying a RACI matrix or an ownership matrix to understand who is responsible for what. And so the RACI matrix, if you're not familiar with it, it's a lean tool of who's responsible, accountable, who do I communicate to, and who do I even inform. And so it allows you to have specific responsibility of, like, when something happens, who owns it, who has responsibility, who just needs to be communicated to, or part of the communication, or consulted or informed. And so involved in someone who's just like making people aware of it happened. And this allows you to ensure you're trying to cover all the bases, prevents gaps in the process and the ownership, and also making sure that you include everybody in any of the communication or critical communication requirements that might be a part of any of the compliance issues or governance management that you might have. So leveraging lean governance artifacts. And so this is a little bit of a maybe unique term, but what I'm trying to get at here is that we don't need to create a whole bunch of documents, a whole bunch of policies, and burden yourself with maybe over engineering the requirements for your governance program. And so taking more of a lean approach to it, where less is better. And I want to be careful here, because what I'm not insinuating is that we're trying to just get by with the minimum and doing the minimum work. What I want to get here is, or hit home here, is what does a manageable governance program look like? So understanding what can you deal with, what can you manage, what is the right amount that meets the intent without overburdening the business, and really starting with creating only what you need. And so for any company, a code of conduct, a conflict policy, and a governance charter is a great place to start. How is everybody supposed to be acting? What happens if you have some sort of conflict of interest, or governance conflict that comes up? What's that escalation? Who's notified? And then some sort of document that says, we have a governance program. This is what it is. This is who's involved, and this is what our process looks like. Using templates and documentation that can be edited, that's easy to update, staying away from using people's names and documentation, and instead talking about positions in the company or roles. And then you can have a secondary addendum or a separate document that tells who the current people are. But what I often see when I was a consultant and I would do audits and look at governance and risk programs, a lot of times they would have people's names in there. They'd be like, oh, yeah, that's the old supply chain director. They haven't been here for 3 years. Well, that right there would be, not just make that document completely useless for the people who are using it, but if being referenced in an audit, it's definitely going to be something that comes up as a finding that your documentation isn't up to date. So using those templates, using things that can be updated easily. A lot of times you can find templates. People in communities like SIA might already have some that they would share with you. And so these are things that I don't think much in the governance community are people trying to hoard their information and not share. Those of us who have been compliance professionals and similar roles before know how hard it can be and are happy to help others and provide information to make life easier. And lastly, one thing I'll point out here is revision control is critical. So having the rev listed, the date of revision, maybe even what was changed as part of the documentation control, again, doesn't have to be overdone, can be simple. For example, a code of conduct should be a 2-page document. These don't have to be 90-page documents where they're written, like in full legalese that no one can understand. It should be, plain language in whatever local language you're using. If you're not in the US, obviously make it usable for the people who will be using it and simplified as much as possible. And lastly, or almost lastly here, scalable oversight. And this is important because most businesses want to grow. Most businesses want to expand their revenue, expand their people, and grow over time. And so why it's critical to have scalable oversight is because you want to be able to have your governance expand and grow as your business expands and grows. So when you look at the type of cadence or check-in that you need to have, again, as I alluded to before, this isn't a one-time activity that you just put on the shelf. You should be touching on a reoccurring basis. Maybe that's monthly, maybe that's quarterly. It's definitely not weekly, unless there's something active and an incident that you're managing. But there does need to be some sort of regular cadence that you're doing. You don't need necessarily need like some sort of large committee, some huge group or a full-time function or department today. You may grow into that as your business expands, but to the context of the SMB world we're talking to today, that would be a bit of overkill. And so that full-time board and like constant meetings, not something you want to, because then it just becomes a check the box activity, and you're just, it starts to have I think the wrong impact. What we want to make sure we're highlighting things when they need to be highlighted on an appropriate basis when you have something to talk about, and not just meeting for the sake of meeting. I mentioned this before, but I'll bring it up again. Leveraging internal knowledge. It's likely that you might have people like when I joined the company I'm at today, and I've worked at other companies, bigger companies where I've been a part of a compliance program, though today I work in product development, technology partnerships, and service support and repair. I'm not directly involved in compliance as a profession, but there are compliance requirements to all of the activities I do. And I have a wealth of knowledge in the field that I can bring to the company here. And so while we have a different group and our director of ops is really responsible for compliance, I'm a key stakeholder that can help build the program in the way we need to build it. And so they leverage me for that service as more of an advisor versus a full-time person. We've also, for like OSHA requirements and some other things that are more applicable to our manufacturing business, we've hired outside consultants that we meet with who did an assessment, provided us information, and then we've insourced that and kind of learned how to do it and transitioned from relying more on advisory and consultation to equipping us as our full-time committee to be able to manage that going forward. So sometimes we think of like, consultants as a dirty word. We don't want to, use outside help, but for things like this that don't necessarily need to be a core competency in our business, that we want to have the acumen to be able to manage that. I think it's very helpful to look at what outside help can be developed for you, especially in that early phase where you may want to do a needs assessment of what your governance and compliance requirements are. That's where some outside help might be very, very useful. And lastly, the governance in action. What are we doing with it once we've set all this information up? And so I think it's critical to continuously review the risks of your business if there's any change that has taken place. Compliance checks, depending on what compliance you're doing, right? What the applicable regulation you're applying to, there has to be some routine proactive reviews so that you're not just caught off guard, that you're not responding to issues, that hopefully you're catching things up front, or even identifying things before they become a problem. And then some sort of documentation like incident logs, some reoccurring documentation of what activities have take place. So if you're doing reviews, if you're doing compliance checks, you did have, a near miss incident or some issue come up, you have that information in a centralized location where you can review it and make it available for others if need be. I think a critical thing is an impact analysis for changes in the business. So if you're selling new products, if you're going into new markets, if you got new customers, anything that would materially change the way that you do things. If you're changing a production process, you're moving from one manufacturer to another, using a different type of material in your production process, it may require some reevaluation to see, does this materially change anything in our business that would change the compliance requirement, either an old compliance requirement, which is no longer applicable, and so we've been able to remediate that or remove it from our business, or triggered a new compliance requirement that we didn't have before that is now in place. And so I think that is something that should be a part of that ongoing cadence, that ongoing process, that monthly or quarterly meeting, asking, is there anything that has changed in the business that requires us to manage this differently? And lastly, and super critically, is understanding and having a clear escalation path and decision documentation. So when things happen, how do you communicate? How do you escalate? Who needs to be involved? And making sure you have the right people, not too many, but the right people in place, and having that scoped out. Again, I think also focusing on not really the people, but the positions as people come and go. You don't want to have to re-updating this or retraining it or evaluating it every single time you have a change in personnel. What to avoid? I think the critical thing here, we've talked about this a few times, but it's worth re-mentioning, is overbuilding your governance too early. We all want to be compliant. We all want to make sure we have in the right things in place. You don't want to make it so that it's so overburdensome that you can't even manage it, because that has the opposite outcome, where you can't be compliant because you've made it too complicated to be compliant because you've overdone it with your governance. So again, there's a dichotomy there of trying to find like that, the appropriate middle ground. That's not too big, not too small, just right. So you might not get it perfect, but that's why we're touching this thing multiple times and not just setting it up and leaving it alone. The confusion between documentation and execution, just writing the document doesn't put into place. How do you train, manage, and deploy and make sure it's a living, breathing process that doesn't just put on the shelf and be in the binder and never touched again? One of the more critical pitfalls is no vendor governance. So if somebody is working for you and providing services or products to you, there could be, and very well might be, a requirement of how you're knowledgeable of what they do, how they're doing it. There are a lot of supply chain requirements in governments or governance frameworks. So understanding those, are they providing you products that meet the specification that are required? Are they doing anything that is not above board that you should be aware of? And there are simple checklists and audits and requirements and questionnaires that can help you manage this, so that you at least are asking the questions about your vendors on what they're doing, how they're doing it, to make sure you don't inadvertently run afoul because you have a supply chain that isn't managing themselves appropriately. And then lastly, not having that role clarity or ownership, where you either get the shrugs of like, whose job is this, or you have too many people running around trying to do the same thing. And so kind of going back to that toolkit of having that RACI matrix or that ownership matrix in place is going to be critical to make sure, hopefully you put it in place, you're touching it, you're talking about it, you never have to deal with it. But if it does happen, you want it to go smoothly, and you want to make sure the right people are involved and are doing what needs to get done. So our governance starter kit, we've talked a little bit about all the different frameworks and pieces and parts that could go into it, but let's make it easy for you. Start small, 4 documents, 3 cadences, 2 owners. What do I mean by that? Have that documentation we talked about before, find out what's applicable, create some documentation, structure your cadences on how you're going to meet and manage it, and then identify 2 people in your organization who could be a part of that initial governance team. Make it simple, make it manageable, get started and grow from there. Start a governance calendar, who does what when. So have your reviews, have your risk evaluation, have your meetings, have your audits, have all that stuff already scheduled, done on a cadence so that there doesn't have to be any guessing about it. When's the last time we did it? Make it a part of your checklist. Have it work for itself versus you have to always think about it. You build the system one time and then you can just repeat it versus having to redo it every time it comes to mind, or anytime you get a questionnaire from a customer or from a vendor that you have to then, oh yeah, let's go get up to date on our governance thing. And then lastly, seek out free tools and templates. Use the SIA community. There's likely companies within this organization, within our community, the greater SIA community, within the security industry network, that have already done what you're trying to do, that are doing it well, that have expertise in the field. And one thing that I know through my 20 years or so in the industry is that we are a community that loves to help one another. And reach out to the ESG group here. We exist to serve you. And so have the opportunity to reach out to us to either get you connected with some folks who would be able to help you, or if we can ourselves provide that information based on the community's knowledge that we can provide to you from the different members of the ESG group on how we could be helpful. All right, so I've talked a lot for the last 40-ish minutes, and I wanted to hold some time here at the end for any questions that might come in. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and if there's any questions, we have the Q&A open, so feel free to put them in there, or if any of our other speakers or panelists have any questions, feel free to chime in now.
Hey, John, that was a really great talk you did. I really appreciate your point of view from the small business position. I know I work for a large organization myself, so it's interesting and relevant to hear how small businesses might begin to even entertain figuring out governance for their own organizations. I guess I had a question. You mentioned using some free tools and frameworks. Are there any that you've been able to use that come to mind kind of off the top of your head that are either free, lightweight, that an SMB, SBM, small business can use?
Yeah, thank you. So I think where I would start, so it's kind of dependent on the governance requirement that you're looking for. And right. So I think that, so it kind of depends on that. But there's organizations like, for cybersecurity, there's a whole network or group of cybersecurity professionals that have, information and documentation, start with like ISC squared and some of those who have these information that they could provide out for like export control. There's another organization also called SIA, SIA, and a couple other federal organizations that are kind of cooperatives between the U.S. government and U.S. companies that can provide that information. And so I think if you kind of find your compliance requirement, you can usually find an association or either an entity like SIA that is responsible for facilitating that profession or that requirement, and they tend to have those templates. And so that's where I'd start. So like, it's hard to give an exhaustive list because the governance requirements can be so varied, but those are two that come to the top of my head. I also think that, again, that's where reaching out to other companies and collaborating and networking with other compliance professionals would really be helpful. They may have documents that they can just wipe their name off of and provide.
No, I love that. The collaboration between organizations within your industry is really relevant. I love the fact that you called out the ESG group within SIA that we have, that we're happy to help, quite honestly. And so I had one other question, if you don't mind.
Yeah. How
can an SMB balance the need for governance within the fast-paced nature of security tech? I mean, everything is evolving so fast these days. Any thoughts on that?
I think really the main thing is to try to stay on top of what is applicable to your business and to what extent. And So meaning, I'll give you an example. I had a conversation with a integrator partner yesterday. It's a smaller, so SMB integrator, and they're a partner of ours. They resell our product, and they wanted to use facial recognition and AI and a lot of this technology, and they're working on a quit for customer. And my first question to them was, have you ever sold this before? Have you successfully deployed it? And do you know what your exposure would be if it doesn't work right? So simply asking those kind of framing questions of like, am I comfortable with this? Do I know how it works? And do I know what my exposure would be if it wouldn't work? And having some of those vetting questions that is part of your technology evaluation, either from product development perspective of, is this a new product that you guys want to evaluate to deploy or use yourself or create yourself, or if you're a partner you're going to work with, an integrator that you say, I might want to sell this thing, know what it is versus just saying, well, the customer is asking for it, I want to deploy it. And so I think that's, and just stay curious and interested. And obviously, if you're on this call, you're likely a member of SIA. There's so many resources at your disposal that you may not be aware of. And so I think that's where, reaching out to members of this group, talking to other CM members who can point you in the right direction. We have working groups for things like, AI governance. I don't know if that's the exact name of the word, but there's an AI working group. And so if you want to know more about it, if you want to know how it impacts you, just kind of stay curious, stay educated. It can be overwhelming. And so that's why I think that the specific advice is try to look at what is applicable to your business or what you want to get into, and then stay as up to date and educated as you can on that, and use the broader SIA community and network, and whether it's going to ISC West and East and seeing what educational opportunities there are there, what products are on the floor, talk to the people, understand it. And I think one of the kind of greatest wisdoms I've heard is from Warren Buffett when he would buy stocks or buy stocks in companies. He'd never invest in anything he didn't understand. I think that's a great way of looking at us, as like, maybe never sell anything you don't understand, because if you don't fully understand, not just the technology, because I don't fully understand the way like deep learning works, but I do understand what the ramifications are if it doesn't work, or what the fallout could be if it's not working the right way. And so I do want to have that understanding if I'm going to be comfortable with selling a product that has that type of technology involved.
No, I love that. Staying curious, I think, is to me on my end is one of the most kind of important aspects of, maintaining compliance in any way, right? Staying curious. And I think that's kind of what you've laid out here is very, stay curious, stay up to date as you can, that kind of thing. Adam, Scott, didn't know if you had any other questions that were out there. Although I do see so I guess there's one in the chat. Adam, do you want me to cover that? You want to ask it? I can't hear you.
I got it. So I can see it in the chat, so I'll read it. So the question is, what's one common misconception you hear from SMBs about governance? I think that the biggest misconception, I'd say there's two equally, is that it doesn't apply to me, or it's too expensive to have a program. And I think I kind of tackled those two misconceptions and why I would disagree with them. But I'll kind of reiterate those points, is that everyone has some sort of compliance that applies to them. So I think you just need to understand, and it doesn't have to be this huge, massive thing, to the best of your ability, knowing what that looks like, what are the requirements, and what are the things. I used to say, when people used to ask me my job when I was a compliance professional, I said the reason why I sit in the executive meetings is because our CEO can go to jail if the stuff that I manage doesn't go well. And so that's a lot of pressure, at a big company back then. But that was really, all the stuff that could get us in trouble, I'm responsible for. And so there is always stuff that can get you in trouble. And so you just want to make sure you know what it is so that you can stay ahead of it and be as compliant as possible. And now the scale could be very, very small, but there always is some stuff, right? That could be OSHA requirements, providing a safe workplace, right? So those things are very wide and broad. And I think we've laid out a pretty good, compelling framework today on how it doesn't have to be super expensive. And so, that is a misnomer, but understand it and then put in processes that don't make it overkill. And then that'll be a way to not have to pay a much. But I will say kind of you got the carrot and the stick. The carrot being is if you have a process in place, you're less likely to have to deal with the costly outcomes that could come with it. And you really, the real cost comes from if you run afoul of a compliance requirement and you don't have a governance program. Because in my experience, the most of the time, if you have a program in place and you identify the problem, you report it, you go through your process, a good governance process doesn't mean you'll never have problems. It means that when they happen, you'll be able to mitigate them and respond to them quickly and resolve them. Usually that is a mitigating factor when it comes to any sort of compliance fallout, meaning if you're going to get a fine or any sort of government response to any activity that you had. If you show that you're trying to govern in a compliant manner, that is certainly a mitigating factor against any sort of fallout that you might have. So it doesn't have to be perfect. Have something in place. Doesn't have to cost a lot. And I promise you, everybody has something that they need to be governing. So figure out what that is for you.
I couldn't agree more. I very much consider my job as keeping the company I work for out of the news. So I hear you on keeping the CEO out of jail. It is very much keeping the company out of the newspaper in any negative way, at least. And so I think we're going to take a short break. Thank you so much, John. We really appreciate your time today and kind of helping small and medium-sized businesses really understand governance a little bit more and kind of why it matters to them. And kind of how they can begin to wrangle it, quite honestly. So thank you for your time. We're going to take a short break and then we'll be back with another topic in just a couple minutes. Thank you, John. We appreciate it.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Yes.